Hello there, and welcome to Now You're Cooking with Gas. This video is about setting up a project with Unreal 5.2's GameplayAbility system. I'm going to start with a third-person C++ project, and I'm going to call it Gas Game. All right, first thing we're going to do is enable the plugin. This will prompt the editor to restart, so we can do that. I'm going to pop the content browser down here. All right, first thing I wanted to do, and I'm going to close the editor for it, is put in the build.cs file. Public dependency module name is just going to append gameplay abilities, tags, and tasks. Save that. Close Visual Studio. All right, we're going to force the project files to be regenerated, just so it picks up that dependency modules. I'm going to relaunch Visual Studio. All right, and then the main header file, I'm going to create an enum. All right, so this is a blueprint type so that it's visible in blueprints. It's an ability input ID that we'll be using for connecting the ability system component to the gameplay ability through this input ID. We're just going to include a fire ability for now. All right, so I'm going to launch the editor from here. I'm going to create a subclass of gameplay ability. This will be right down near the bottom. I'm going to call this a GG for gas game, gameplay ability. I'm going to use the public-private setup. This will have the editor recompile. Since I'm running it through Visual Studio, I'm just going to close it directly to reload. I clicked too quickly, so that popped up. All right, that's reloaded. So in the header file, I'm just going to include one directory back, the gas game header file. So gas game here will be the name of your project. And then here I'm going to paste in that. All right. So this auto formats the code. I don't like that design or the indents that it loves to put in. So I'm just going to hit undo, Control Z, and put it back in that format. Once that's done, I can add the ability system component to the character. So in the character, I'm going to need to put this interface, ability system interface. Also need to include that header file. And then to use this interface, you need to include a function to get ability system component. And to include the component itself. So I'm going to do that right up here, plus the other components. In the CPP file, I also need to include ability system component instead of interface. Throw it in down here. So this will create the component and ensure that it's replicated. Can also add the function that we defined here. And all that's doing is returning the ability system component variable. We also need to set it up by calling init ability actor info. So we're going to add possess by and onRep player state. So these are overrides from character or pawn above that. I'm going to create these functions. All right, so in both cases, actually it'll be doing the same code. Except this needs to be possessed by. All right, so we're calling super, the parent function. That's almost always required. We're ensuring that the ability system component is not null. And then we're calling init ability actor info. We're sending this for both the owner and the avatar. These can differ typically if you're going to include your ability system component in the player state instead of this character. I will link documentation to Tranic gas documentation on GitHub in the description. It has a lot of useful information, quite a bit of information overload actually. Once you've gotten a little better handle of how this works, you can read through some of that, and it's a pretty good read. It has some things that I will be doing very similarly, some things that I'll do a little differently. If you've looked at other tutorials and videos online, written and YouTube, you will see a lot of them refer back to that documentation or refer to Lyra, the project that was built for 5.0. Unreal 5.0 GameplayAbility system as an example. But for beginners, this is probably a better start. All right, the character class. This is already created, but if you need, you need to copy this. You can get it from going in here, go to the definition, you can search for player input component, and if you want to override that, you just basically copy that, throw it in here. So for that, we're going to set up a bind input function. We're going to use a Boolean here. To represent whether it's been called or not. What this function does. All right, so we're going to make sure we haven't previously set it up. The ability system component is valid and input component is valid. We're creating a top level asset path. It's pointing to the root script gas game. Gas game is the name of this project. This may be different for you. And it's calling bind ability activation to input component on the ability system component to basically connect the input component with these values and the values of the enum for confirm and cancel. Ability system component will have other functions called on it to do with the input component when we set that up in a little bit. Bind input itself needs to be called from set up player input component. And I'll also call it from here. It's being called in both places just to ensure it gets called and at a valid time. The order's not always guaranteed with Unreal. All right, next we'll add some default ability and effects. All right, so gameplay abilities and gameplay effects, which is the reason we're here. Gameplay abilities are things that are effectively actions. Throwing a punch or shooting a projectile or maybe jumping, sprinting, etc. Those can all be abilities. Effects are typically things that change attributes, and attributes are, stats, ability scores, etc. on characters or other things. So here we are going to be creating two functions to initialize them. I'm exposing two arrays, two blueprints, which include the GameplayAbility class that we created and the GameplayEffect. Initialize abilities should only run on the server, so it's going to check has authority, and of course, ability system component. It is just going to iterate through the default abilities, and it's going to call ability system components give ability. It is sending along the ability variable, the level, and the input ID that is set up in that ability, which we will show in the editor shortly, in the source object. Similarly, we're going to set up initialize effects. This will run very similarly, but it's got a little bit more work. It does not need to run only on the server. So in this case, we are going to be creating an effect context, iterating through the default effects, creating a outgoing spec using that effect context, and then as long as that's valid, we're going to apply the gameplay effect spec to self. The blueprint version of this is effectively the same. It would be calling make effect context, make outgoing spec, and applying the gameplay effect. Similarly, up here you can call give ability from blueprints. All right, so first we're going to compile. While I forget to call initialize abilities and effects. Oh, probably forgot to include. Forgotten as. Also forgot to pass along this variable. That's what I get for not copying and pasting everything. to include the GameplayAbility that we created. I'm going to add the calls to initialize. All right, and possessed by, we're going to be calling initialize, abilities, and effects. And on rep player state, we just call initialize effects. All right, we're going to launch the editor, and we're going to create a subclass of AttributeSet. I call that GG AttributeSet. All right. The editor is doing its thing. All right, so we'll close that. All right. Just going to manually reopen this. All right, so in the attribute set, we want to use the macro that is provided in the base class here. If you scroll all the way down, you'll find this handy macro, attribute accessors. Copy that into here. This is for setting up your attributes and giving it some utility functions that we'll see later. So here we're going to create constructor. Use the macro to create the functions for these. We need the actual attributes. So the attribute is a gameplay attribute data. We're using health and max health for this example. We're setting up onRep to replicate the values when they change to other clients using these functions. All right. We'll start with the constructor. We're going to set health to 40, max health to 60. And to replicate the variables, we need get lifetime replicated props. So in that, we'll be calling do rep lifetime condition notify, sending the attributes that we want replicated, and sending rep notify always. For this, we need to include net Unreal Network. So in the onReps, we're basically just calling gameplay attribute rep notify for the class, the variable, and the old version. Once that's done, we can override two other functions. Pre-attribute base change and pre-attribute change. Those are called in slightly different circumstances when the values change, and we can use those to call clamp attribute. So in this case, both these functions are doing the same Same thing by calling clamp attribute change, sending along the attribute and the new value. In clamp attribute, we are checking to see if it is the health attribute that is being changed. If so, we're setting the value between 0 and the max health. For example, if you wanted to check the max health, you can do the same. If the attribute is equal to get max health attribute, then you can clamp it between, say, 1 minimum and whatever maximum you think is appropriate. We need to add these attributes to the character. You include the header file. And create it. Compile that. So naturally, I forgot to include it in here as well. That's ability system component again. We launch the editor from here. All right, so if we run the game, hit tilde to bring up the console, show debug ability system. You can see that the attributes here have been added. Health set to 40 and max health to 60 as it was set up in the constructor. So I'm going to create a folder in content called gas. Create a subfolder called effects. And create a gameplay effect in here. You need to click on all classes when you create a blueprint class. Gameplay effect. We call this GE default attributes. All right, so I like to have this docked up here by default. So I'm going to close that, go into editor preferences, and right here under asset editor open location, I'm just going to set this to main window. When I open it, it's up there. All right, so there's a lot in GameplayEffect and abilities. For now, we're just going to deal with the basics. So this is an instant effect. That means it applies instantly. We're going to be using override types for our modifiers, which means an instant override will set the base value of an attribute. That will be relevant later. We're going to add 2. Open these up. I'm going to open up modifier magnitude as well. Up here, we're going to set health and then max health. So we're going to set both to 100. I also like to open this, save on compile always. So all my blueprints and other things I edit, anytime I hit compile, it's saved. I don't have to click that as well. So I'm going to go into the third person character. I'm going to look for my default effects down here, and I'm going to add the one I just created. Play again. Bring up the debug. You can see that health is 60 and max health is 160. So, 2 things that I did there. First of all, I set the max health to 100, but I did not set it to override. It was still set as default on add. So it took the base 60 and added the 100. but then the health is only 60, and you're wondering, why is that not also 160? Well, that is because of the order. So at the point in time that this one is set, which is before this one, it will set health to, well, in this case, plus, which we want as override. It added 100 to the 40 that was there, and then it called the pre-attribute change, which called clamp attribute that we saw was setting it between 0 and max health. Max health at this point in time was 60. So that's why the health ended up as 60. And then we set the max health was also add, so it was actually 100 plus, or 60 plus the 100, and became that. So to fix the 160, we changed this to override. To fix the other issue, it's because this needs to be health and this needs to be max health. So that this happens first. When clamp is called at this point, then 100 is the max and it gets set properly. And now you can see it's set to 100, 100. All right, next we're going to create a folder for abilities. I'm going to create just a basic one. This will be our GameplayAbility class we created. Call this GameplayAbility. In here we have two events, ActivateAbility and onEndAbility. ActivateAbility is called when we hit the appropriate input, which up here we're going to set that to FireAbility. This is called, we'll just throw a print in here, and we can't leave it like this. So anytime ActivateAbility is called, exiting needs to be calling EndAbility. So if this is not included, the first time it runs, this will run. You'll see the print. And then unability, if it's not here, it won't get called. Try to run this again, and it will effectively just ignore it because it thinks it's already running, or still running. Actually, another good thing you want to have in here is commit ability. So commit ability will be using this cost gameplay effect class down here. So this would be a gameplay effect that you set to subtract like 1 from a charge or whatever number from ammo or something similar. As long as the value is still above 0 in that case, it will continue and do the rest of the ability. So that is currently not set up. And for that we need to include input. So you may be familiar with the action mappings of 5.0 and before. Enhanced input was added in 5.0. It was made the default in new projects in 5.1. So we're using it here in 5.2. This project already sets up a bunch of that, but basically it's two components that are needed, and they need to be connected to the character. So first of all, you need a input mapping context. When you open this, you can see that it has a list of mappings for the ones that this editor already included. And then those are the actions. So what these actions are, movement is, WASD or controller, which will be an axis 2D type. Jump is a Boolean type, the most basic type, so that's very common. That is also the default. So if I just create a new one here under input action, call it IA fire ability. Open that up. You can see it's the same as the jump. Then we need to include that in here. That is fire ability. Just going to click this little button, left click, and set it to left mouse button as opposed to just going through this list, which is massive. But if you wanted to, you can just find mouse under here. That also needs to be connected in the player. So you'll see under input here, we have the actions that are already created, and we don't have one yet for ours. I'm going to close down the editor, going back to Visual Studio. All right. So in the character, we're just going to add another action here. We need to include a function to bind to. And also going to include a utility function, send ability local input. Send along the input ID. So in the setup input, we need to add our own here. I'm just going to copy this one. So this will be the fire ability action, and it will be calling on fire ability. Create this function. This is just calling send ability local input that we just created, sending along the value and the input ID. I did call it that, okay. Oops. Create this function. All right, so we're ensuring that the ability consistent component is not null. The value that we know we're sending is a Boolean type. We're checking to see if it's true or false. If it's true, we're calling ability system components ability at local input pressed or released, and we're sending along the input ID. This is how the ability system basically launches or activates a gameplay ability based on the input ID. We'll compile this. Back in the editor. So the fire ability action has been set up here. It also needs to be set up in here. We also need to make sure that ability is part of default abilities. All right. So now when I hit left mouse button, it's calling print. You can see it's doing it many more times. So it's being activated every single time or every tick, basically, that the key is held down. The reason why this is because in here there are no triggers. So if I add pressed, what happens here is now I hold down the button and you just get one. So it's activated when left mouse button down, and that's it. However, if we wanted to have an ability which waits for the input to be released, so for something to happen on release, we can call that an ability no longer should be called from here. It needs to be called here. We'll include another print. Go in, and now I'm holding the left mouse button when I release. nothing happened. I click it again, nothing is happening. The reason this is because in here, if you have a gameplay ability that you want to do the release functionality for, you need to also add it here. There, now I can click it. All right, thanks for watching. If you like the video and you'd like to see more, you know what to do. If you have suggestions on future content or abilities you'd like to see, let me know. I will flesh out this fire ability a little bit in the next video, and following that, there will be a video about damage calculations and some other features from various games, mostly action RPGs.